Hello, creatives! Watercolor is about understanding how water, paint, and paper work together. In this video, I'd like to share a few things I wish someone had explained to me when I was starting out. Because this workshop is all about water and reflections, we'll finish by exploring how I paint water in my own work. So let's begin. Brushes. For me, a brush is simply an extension of the hand. It's the tool that helps us transfer an idea onto paper. Most watercolor brushes fall into three categories: natural hair, synthetic, and mixed brushes. Synthetic brushes usually feel firmer and easier to control. Natural hair tends to hold more water and pigment. Modern synthetic brushes have improved enormously over the years, and honestly, sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference just by touch. Another thing I think is worth mentioning is how you hold your brush. When I hold it close to the ferrule, my strokes become more controlled and precise. This is useful for details and small shapes. When I move my hand further back along the handle, my painting becomes looser and more expressive. Exactly the same brush can create completely different marks depending on how you hold it. Let's look at some common brush shapes. A large wash brush is perfect for applying clean water and creating broad washes. Round brushes are probably the most versatile brushes in watercolor and the ones I used most often. Flat and angled brushes can be wonderful for reflections, water textures, and certain architecture details. Liner brushes are excellent for masts, rigging, branches, wires, and other fine linear elements. You don't need every brush shape available. A few well-chosen brushes can do almost everything. Brush care isn't the most exciting topic, but it can save you a surprising amount of money. Many artists think a brush is clean because the rinse water looks clean, but let's have a look. Even after rinsing, you can see how much pigment is still trapped inside the hairs once soap is introduced. I've been using this little cleaning tray for more than 3 years now, and it's still one of my favorite studio tools. So, a few simple habits can greatly extend the life of your brushes. Just try not to leave them standing in water, avoid bending the hairs when brush is dry, wash them properly after each painting session, and when cleaning, I recommend gently rotating the brush in one direction rather than scrambling aggressively from side to side. That helps preserve the shape of the tip. If synthetic brush begins to lose its point, warm water can often help the hairs return to their original shape. Finally, think about storage. Whether you use a brush stand like mine or a travel case, the most important thing is protecting the hairs from damage. A good brush can serve you for many years if you treat it well. There are some of brushes I reach for again and again. For wetting the paper, I usually use a large goat hair wash brush, especially when I'm not using a spray bottle. For my first washes, I prefer very soft brushes such as Da Vinci Casaneo and Tintoretto 1477. You may also notice that the Tintoretto has a slightly unusual ferrule design. This isn't just for appearance. The shape allows the brush to hold a larger reservoir for water and pigment, which means I can paint for longer before reloading. One reason I love these brushes is that they don't disturb the paper surface while it's wet. They allow me to move large amounts of water and pigment gently across the paper. For most of my paintings, my real workhorses are two brushes, Oasis and Escoda Perla. If I'm working on painting, there is a good chance I can complete almost the entry piece using one of them. I love the control they give me, the sharp point, and the amount of water they hold. But because I work on heavily textured papers, especially rough papers, a Skoda brush naturally wear down over time. Here you can see the difference between an older brush and a newer one. That's completely normal. Textured paper is wonderful for creating interesting effects, but it can be damaging on synthetic brushes. One of the most useful things you can learn as a watercolor artist is how to read the label on paint tube. Different manufacturers may use different names for similar colors, but the pigment code tells you exactly what's inside. Most professional watercolors are pigment-based. On the label, you'll usually see a code beginning with the letter P for pigment, followed by letters and numbers that identify the color family and the specific pigment. You also find information about light fastness, which tells you how well the color resists fading over time. Another habit I strongly recommended is making color swatches. There are some of mine. A swatch shows you how a color behaves, how transparent it is, how it looks when diluted with water, and how it changes as it dries. This becomes especially useful when working with granulation colors because they can behave very differently depending on the amount of water you use. Personally, I would rather spend time making swatches than buying colors I don't really need. It helps me understand the paints I already have and make better choices when adding new colors to my palette. Now let's talk about what I believe is one of the most important materials in watercolor: paper. Honestly, for a long time I thought better brushes would improve my paintings. Then I thought it was the paints. But eventually I realized that paper was often the reason something worked or didn't. Most watercolor papers are made from either cellulose or cotton, and I'd like to show you something that helped me understand the difference years ago. Let's imagine we're looking at a sheet of paper from the side. This is cellulose and this is cotton. When we paint on cellulose paper, a lot of the pigment tends to stay closer to the surface. Cotton behaves differently. The water and the pigment are able to travel deeper into the fibers. And this actually is one of the reasons why artists talk so much about cotton paper. Many people ask me how some watercolor artists manage to build beautiful transparent layers without everything becoming muddy. Very often, the answer isn't secret technique, it's the paper. Let's look at a simple example. I'll apply the same paint to both papers and then try lifting it. You can already see the difference. On cellulose paper, the pigment lifts much more easily because so much of it remains on the surface. Cotton still allows lifting, but the paint settles deeper into the sheet. And this is one of the reasons layering feels very different on cotton paper. I still use cellulose paper. It's wonderful for studies, quick sketches, color testing, and practice work. But when I want time, softness, and multiple layers, I usually reach for cotton. Another thing you'll notice when working with different papers is how they react to water. Some papers can become damaged surprisingly quickly if they're overworked. You may notice little fibers starting to appear on the surface. Sometimes artists call this paper peels. Once that happens, the surface no longer behaves quite the same way. That's one reason I always encourage people to work gently and let the paper do some of the work. Now let's look at texture, because cotton paper doesn't come in just one version. Hot press is very smooth. It's often popular with botanical arts and people who enjoy lots of details. Cold press has more modern texture and is probably the most common choice. And then there is rough paper. This is my personal favorite. If you've seen my paintings, you've probably already guessed that. I love the way the texture catches pigment. I love the way granulating colors settle into the surface. And I especially love what it does when painting water, stone, and atmosphere. And of course, you also see different paper weights: 185 GSM, 300 GSM, 640 GSM, and even higher. Generally speaking, the lighter the paper, the more likely it is to buckle when lots of water is involved. Personally, I work on 300 GSM most of the time. It gives me enough straight to use plenty of water without making the process complicated. Now let's talk about paint consistency. One of the things that confused me when I first started painting was how the same color could behave so differently from one painting to another. The answer is often water. In watercolor, artists sometimes use simple terms like tea, coffee, cream, and butter to describe the relationship between water and pigment. Tea is mostly water with a small amount of pigment. This is what I usually use for my first washes and the lightest areas of painting. Coffee contains a little more pigment and is often useful for building forms and depths. Cream is richer and more concentrated. This is where I often begin creating stronger shadows, textures, and details. And finally, butter is almost pure pigment with very little water. Next, I'd like to show you something that has a huge influence on the way watercolor behaves: the moisture of paper. For me, there are three simple stages: dry, wet, and damp. Let's start with dry paper. You can recognize it immediately. The surface has no shine. It feels warm to the touch, and when you place a brush stroke down, it stays exactly where you put it. The paint doesn't travel very far, which gives you much more control over edges, details, and texture. Now let's look at wet paper. When the surface is very wet, you'll see a strong reflection of light across the paper. Sometimes there may even be small puddles sitting on the surface. If you place paint into that amount of water, it will spread quickly and often create blooms, backgrounds, and those little spider-like marks that many beginners accidentally discover. And finally, we have damp paper. This is probably my favorite stage when painting water. The shine becomes much softer than on wet paper. There are no visible puddles, but the paper still contains plenty of moisture. If you touch it gently with the back of your hand, it feels cool, but your skin doesn't pick up any water. For me, this is usually the perfect moment to paint ripples, reflections, and soft transitions. Once you begin to see the difference between dry, wet, and damp, many things that once felt unpredictable suddenly start to make sense. I'd like to show you something I find fascinating about granulation colors. Both of these samples were painted using exactly the same paint. The only difference is the moisture of the paper. On this side, the paint was applied onto very wet paper. You can see how the pigment had much more freedom to move, separate, and settle into the texture of the paper. On this side, the paper was only damp. The paint still moved, but much less. The texture became tighter, more controlled, and the granulation stayed closer to where I place it. This is one of the reasons I always say that watercolor is really a conversation between paint, water, and paper. Let's move on to washes. This may look like a very simple exercise, but it's actually one of the best ways to learn how water behaves on paper. For an even wash, I usually wet the area first, then I load my brush with a light mixture, usually tea or coffee consistency. Something worth paying attention to is the amount of water in your brush. When the belly of the brush is full of water and pigment, it's perfect for washes. If you wipe the brush off the edge of your water pot, you'll remove some of that moisture. If you blot it on the paper towel, it becomes almost dry. The condition of the brush is just as important as the condition of the paper. For this wash, I simply moving the pigment across the surface and allowing gravity to help me. That's why I often paint with my board slightly tilted. Once the wash is down, I leave it alone and let it dry naturally. Let's look at a graded wash. I begin with a stronger mixture at the top. The important thing is to leave a small bit of paint at the bottom edge of each stroke. That little bit is doing most of the work for us. I rinse the brush slightly, make the mixtures weaker, and then pull that bit down into the next stroke. Every new stroke contains a little more water and a little less pigment. And I'd like to show you a technique I use quite often to make wash feel more alive. In reality, very few things have a perfectly flat color. Water, skies, foam, walls, reflections, they all contain subtle shifts in temperature and color. One way to introduce that variation is to work on wet paper. Here I'm starting with a base wash using a mixture around coffee consistency. While the surface is still wet, I pick up another color and drop it into the wash. At this stage, the paper is doing a lot of work for us. The pigment spread, merge, and create soft transitions on their own. Sometimes I add small touches, sometimes little dots, sometimes larger shapes. There isn't really a right or wrong way to do it. The goal is simply to create natural color variation. And let's compare that to working on damp paper. This area has already been covered with a wash and has started to dry. The surface is still cool and slightly damp, but no longer wet. When I add a second color now, the result is very different. The pigment still softens into the surface, but it stays much closer to where I place it. The marks become more visible, more textured, and easier to control. Personally, I use both approaches depending on the effect I'm after. Wet paper creates softer, more atmospheric transitions. Damp paper gives me more structure and more control. Neither is better than the other. They are simply different tools that create different moods. And now, finally, let's talk about water. If you ever wondered what the secret is, for me it always comes back to three things: the moisture of the paper, the consistency of the paint, and the condition of the brush. For this type of ripple and tendril wave pattern, I almost always work on damp paper. No wet, no dry, damp. At this stage, the paper still accepts the paint beautifully, but the brush strokes don't spread uncontrollable. I can soften them, adjust them, and still keep their shape. Next comes the paint mixture. For these marks, I usually work with something closer to cream consistency. Not quite butter, but definitely stronger than coffee. I want enough pigment, so the brush stroke remains visible even after it softens slightly on the paper. The third thing is the brush itself. For water, I often use a flat brush or an angled brush because they naturally create the shape I'm looking for. Notice that I'm not painting long straight lines. The movement is very gentle. I touch the paper, apply a little pressure, and then lift the brush away. That's create a soft beginning, a fuller center, and a soft ending. And that's much closer to how ripples behave in real water. Another thing to remember is perspective. The ripples closer to us appear wider and larger. As they move further into the distance, they become narrower, smaller, and closer together. Even if the color stays exactly the same, changing the size of the marks immediately creates a feeling of depth. Personally, when I mix colors for water, I almost always include lavender and cobalt turquoise light. Those two colors are permanent residents of my palette. Together, they create beautiful variations of water, from cool reflections to soft atmospheric shadows. If I need a darker mixture, I usually add a natural tint or a deeper blue. And one final thing, water is rarely just blue. It reflects the sky, surrounding objects, the weather, and the light around it. That's why I always look for subtle color shifts rather than painting one flat color. The more variation you introduce, the more natural the water begins to feel. Most importantly, try to avoid hard ledges wherever possible. Water is all about soft transitions. Use a clean damp brush to soften edges, blend shapes together, and create gentle movement between light and shadow. And that's really the foundation of how I approach painting water in watercolor. So that's the end of the theory section. Now it's your turn to experiment a little, take some time to try these exercises, get a feel for the mixtures, the paper, and the different levels of moisture. Watercolor is something we learn with our hands as much as with our eyes. See you!